My name is Ainsley and I am 24. For as long as I can remember, the value of my presence in the family home was measured in direct proportion to the size of my paycheck. My parents, Richard and Elena, view life through the cold, calculated lens of social standing and financial momentum. My brother, Julian, has always been the golden child, a high-flying corporate attorney who buys their affection with luxury cruises and designer watches. I, on the other hand, was the one who chose a path in social services. I wanted to help people, a drive that my father often dismissed as a cute hobby until it was time for me to grow up and get a real job the week before Christmas. The nonprofit I worked for lost its primary funding. I was part of a mass layoff, effective immediately. I drove to my parents' house for our annual Christmas Eve dinner with a hollow pit in my stomach, hoping for once that the holiday spirit might translate into a shred of parental empathy. The driveway was packed with expensive SUVs, the house glowing with thousands of dollars worth of professional light displays. Inside, the air smelled of expensive pine and roasting duck. I waited until the main course to break the news. I thought maybe, between the toasts to Julian's recent promotion, there might be a gap for a daughter in need. When I quietly mentioned that I had been let go and might need a place to stay for a few weeks while I interviewed for new roles, the silence that followed was sharper than the winter wind outside. My father didn't even put down his wine glass. He looked at me with a mixture of boredom and disgust. He told me that they had raised me to be a contributor, not a drain. Elena was even more blunt. She lamented how she had already told her friends I was up for a director position, and now I was making her look like a liar. The tension escalated until Julian made a snide comment about how I was always the dead weight of the family, dragging down their collective success with my mediocre choices. It broke me. I stood up to defend myself, but my father pointed a finger toward the door. He told me that if I couldn't bring anything to the table, I didn't deserve a seat at it. He said they were tired of my problems and that I should leave before the dessert course so I wouldn't ruin the photos. I was kicked out of my family Christmas in the middle of a burgeoning blizzard, with nothing but a crate of my office belongings in the trunk of my beat-up sedan. The drive back toward the city was a nightmare. The highway was a sheet of black ice, and visibility was down to a few feet. My heater was struggling, and my tears were blurring my vision even further. I was about 40 miles from my apartment when I saw the flicker of hazard lights deep in a ditch off a sharp embankment. Most people were speeding past, desperate to get home, but I couldn't just leave someone out there in sub-zero temperatures. I pulled over, my boots crunching into knee-deep snow. At the bottom of the ravine, a pristine silver sedan was crumpled against a heavy oak tree. Inside were two elderly people, a man and a woman, both looking dazed and bloodied. The driver, a man who looked to be in his late 70s, was trying to kick the door open, but the frame was twisted shut. The woman in the passenger seat was unconscious, her head lolling at an unnatural angle. I didn't have a phone signal in the valley, so I knew it was up to me. I spent the next 2 hours in the freezing dark using a tire iron from my trunk to pry the door frame just enough to reach them. The man, who I later learned was named Arthur, kept whispering that his wife, Evelyn, had a heart condition and needed her medication, which was in the trunk. I climbed into the wreckage, ignored the scent of leaking gasoline, and managed to retrieve her bag. I stayed with them, wrapping them in the emergency blankets I kept for my clients and using my own body heat to keep Evelyn warm while I waited for a break in the storm to flag down a passing salt truck. By the time the paramedics arrived, I was borderline hypothermic. My hands were shredded from the jagged metal of their car, and my toes were numb. I gave the medics the information I had, watched them load the couple into the ambulance, and then curled back into my own car. No one asked for my name in the chaos, and I didn't think to give it. I just wanted to go home to my empty apartment and figure out how I was going to survive the month without a job or a family. I woke up late the next day, Christmas morning, to a silent phone. No Merry Christmas texts from my parents. No check-in from Julian. Just a cold room and a sense of total isolation. I turned on the local news just to have some background noise while I boiled water for tea. That's when I saw it. The lead story wasn't about the weather. It was about a miracle on the icy highway. The news anchor described the rescue of Arthur and Evelyn Sterling. My heart stopped. I recognized the names immediately. Arthur Sterling was the founder of Sterling Global, one of the largest philanthropic investment firms in the country. He was a billionaire, a man my father had spent decades trying to secure a meeting with. The report showed the wreckage I had climbed into, now a charred skeleton of metal because the car had exploded minutes after the ambulance pulled away. The reporter mentioned that the couple was in stable condition, but they were searching for the mystery woman who had saved their lives. Arthur had told the paramedics that a young woman, an angel in a faded coat, had risked her life to pull them out and keep them warm. He said she was the only reason they were alive to see Christmas morning. He ended his statement by saying he wouldn't rest until he found her and rewarded her for her bravery. I sat on my floor, staring at the screen, my bruised hands trembling. Just as the segment ended, my phone began to vibrate. It was a call from my father. I knew he had seen the report. I knew he had recognized my car in the grainy footage captured by the sold truck's dashcam. The game was about to change, but they had no idea that the dead weight was about to become the most powerful person in the family. I stared at my phone as it vibrated against the hardwood floor, my father's name flashing across the screen like a warning signal. Usually, I would have answered on the first ring, desperate for a crumb of approval or a sign that he regretted throwing me out into a blizzard. But things felt different now. The cold that had seeped into my bones on that highway hadn't quite left me, and it had frozen over the part of my heart that used to beat for their validation. I let the call go to voicemail. Within seconds, a text message arrived from my mother. Ainsley, darling, we were so worried about you. We saw the news and recognized your car. Please tell us you are all right. We feel terrible about the misunderstanding last night. Come home for Christmas lunch. We saved you a plate. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh that echoed through my tiny, dark apartment. A misunderstanding. That was what they were calling it now that I was potentially linked to the wealthiest man in the state. Last night, I was a drain on their resources. Today, I was a social asset they couldn't afford to lose. I spent the next hour ignoring a barrage of messages. Julian even tried to call, likely realizing that if I became a favorite of Arthur Sterling, his own law firm would kill for an introduction. I ignored him too. Instead, I cleaned the grease and blood from under my fingernails and bandaged the deep cuts on my palms. My body ached with a physical heaviness, but my mind was sharpening. I realized that for the first time in 24 years, I held all the cards. Around noon, a black SUV pulled up to my apartment complex. It wasn't my father. Two men in charcoal suits stepped out, looking incredibly out of place in my neighborhood. When I opened the door, they were polite and professional. They were from Sterling Global's security detail. They explained that Mr. Sterling had used his resources to track the license plate seen in the highway footage. They weren't there to harass me. They were there to deliver an invitation. Arthur and Evelyn wanted to see me. As soon as I was able, I dressed in the best clothes I had left, which weren't much, but I made sure I looked composed. As the driver took me toward the private wing of the city's top hospital, my phone buzzed again. It was a group chat message from my father. He had sent a photo of a massive floral arrangement he had sent to the hospital in my name, claiming he was just so proud of his brave daughter. He was already trying to weave himself into the narrative, trying to ensure that when I met Arthur, I would mention how supportive my family had been. He was even positioning himself to be my representative. When I walked into the private suite, the atmosphere was a world away from the chaos of the roadside. Arthur was sitting up in bed, his arm in a sling, while Evelyn lay in the bed beside him, hooked up to monitors, but awake and smiling. The moment Arthur saw me, his eyes welled with tears. He didn't see a girl who had lost her job or a dead weight who brought problems. He saw the person who had crawled into a gasoline-soaked wreck to save his wife. We talked for hours. I didn't mention my family at first. I told them about my work in social services, about why I cared so much about people who had been discarded by society. Arthur listened with a level of intensity I had never received from my own father. When I finally mentioned, with a shaky voice, that I had actually been let go from my job the very day of the accident, Arthur's expression hardened, not with judgment, but with a protective sort of anger. He asked me where I had been headed when I found them. I hesitated, then told him the truth. I told him I had been kicked out of my family's Christmas because I was unemployed and deemed a burden. I told him how they had prioritized their image over my safety. The room went silent. Arthur looked at Evelyn, and a silent communication passed between them. He then turned back to me and said that a person with my courage and character shouldn't be looking for a job. He said he had been looking for someone to head his new foundation's urban renewal project, a position with a salary that made my father's annual earnings look like pocket change. But he didn't stop there. He told me he had seen the flowers sent by my father and the dozens of messages from my family members trying to gain access to the suite by claiming they were my support system. He asked me how I wanted to handle them. He offered me a chance to show them exactly what happens when you discard someone who turns out to be indispensable. I felt a cold, calm power wash over me. I told Arthur I wanted to accept the position, but I wanted the public announcement to happen in a very specific way. I wanted my family to be invited to the Sterling Global New Year's Gala, an event they had spent 10 years trying to get into. I wanted them to think they were finally being rewarded for my actions. I wanted them to arrive in their finest clothes, ready to brag about their hero daughter, only to realize that I had already cut the ties. As I left the hospital, I finally called my father back. His voice was oily and sweet, filled with false pride. He told me he was so glad I was okay, and that he had already told all his associates that his daughter was the mystery hero. He told me the whole family was waiting for me at the house to celebrate. I told him I couldn't make it, but that I had a surprise for them. I told him I had secured 5 VIP passes to the Sterling Gala. He nearly choked on his drink, stammering about how this would change everything for the family. I hung up before he could say another word. He was right about one thing. It was going to change everything, but not for him. My family thought they were about to ride my coattails into the upper echelons of society. They didn't realize I was about to let go of the rope and watch them fall. The days leading up to the New Year's Gala were a masterclass in calculated silence. My phone was a constant furnace of notifications. My mother sent photos of shimmering evening gowns she had picked out for me, assuming we would be shopping together on her dime now that I was her golden ticket. Julian sent me a list of high-profile partners at his firm he wanted me to mention to Arthur Sterling. Even my father, a man who rarely used emojis, was sending heart symbols and calling me his brave little girl. I didn't correct them. I didn't tell them that the VIP passes I had sent over were not for the main ballroom's head table, but for a very specific, public location where they would have a front row seat to their own social demise. Arthur Sterling was more than a billionaire. He was a man who understood the weight of a debt. When I visited him at his estate to finalize the details of my new role, he showed me the intelligence his team had gathered. My father's firm was actually struggling, a fact Richard had hidden behind leased Sun luxury cars and a mountain of credit card debt. He wasn't just looking for social standing by using me. He was looking for a financial bailout. He expected that my new connection to the Sterling fortune would lead to a massive investment in his failing business. Arthur looked at me over the rim of his glasses and asked if I wanted him to help them. I told him I wanted him to do exactly what they had done to me, treat them according to their worth. The night of the gala arrived. The Sterling mansion was a palace of glass and light, perched on a hill overlooking the frozen city. Hundreds of the most influential people in the country were there, dripping in diamonds and speaking in the hushed tones of old money. My family arrived in a rented limousine, dressed to the nines. their faces flushed with the intoxicating scent of proximity to power. My father adjusted his tuxedo in the grand foyer, chest puffed out, already introducing himself to strangers as the father of the woman who saved Arthur Sterling. He was handing out business cards like he was the guest of honor. I was already inside, tucked away in a private dressing room. I wasn't wearing the dress my mother had picked. Arthur had arranged for a custom-made gown in a deep, midnight blue that felt like armor. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the girl who had cried in a freezing car 5 days ago. I saw a woman who had been forged in the ice dot as the clock neared midnight. The music faded, and Arthur took the stage in the main ballroom. The crowd went silent. My family had pushed their way to the very front of the cordoned-off guest area, right beneath the podium, beaming with practiced, humble smiles. They were ready for their close-up. They were ready for Arthur to call them up and thank them for raising such a selfless daughter. My mother even had a tissue ready to dab at her eyes for the cameras. Arthur began to speak. He talked about the accident, about the terror of being trapped in a burning car, and the hand that reached through the dark to pull him out. He spoke about the character of a person who helps others when they have nothing themselves. Then, his voice turned cold. He mentioned that he had been deeply moved by the story of this young woman, not just because of her bravery, but because of the adversity she had faced that very night. He told the room, and the local news crews filming the event, that the hero of the highway had been discarded by her own flesh and blood just hours before the crash. The room went deathly still. I watched from the wings as the color drained from my father's face. Arthur didn't name them, but he didn't have to. He projected a series of photos on the large screens behind him. They weren't photos of me. They were screenshots of the security footage from my father's own driveway on Christmas Eve, provided by a disgruntled neighbor, showing me being shoved out into the snow while my father pointed toward the street. Then, he showed the text messages Julian had sent me just that morning, asking me to use Arthur to manipulate a legal case. The gasps from the elite crowd were like a physical wave. My mother looked like she was going to faint. My father tried to step back, to hide in the crowd. But the people around them, the very people they had spent their lives trying to impress, parted like the Red Sea, leaving them standing in a circle of isolation. They were no longer the family of a hero. They were the villains of a Christmas story that was being broadcast to the entire city. Arthur then turned his head and called my name. I walked out onto the stage, the light blindingly bright. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at my father. I saw the moment he realized that his gamble had failed. I saw the moment Julian realized his career was over before it had truly begun. Arthur took my hand and officially announced me as the new CEO of the Sterling Foundation's Global Outreach Program, granting me full autonomy over a multi-million-dollar budget. He then added, with a sharp smile, that the Sterling family would be cutting all ties with any businesses associated with the name Richard or Julian Vance, effective immediately. As the security detail began to quietly escort my family out of the ballroom to avoid a scene, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had spent 24 years trying to fit into their world, only for them to throw me away when I became inconvenient. Now, I was the one closing the door. If you are enjoying this journey of justice, and want to see more stories where the underdog finally wins, please subscribe to my channel My Calm Revenge. Your support helps me bring more of these powerful stories to life. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind of public acclaim and private devastation for the people who once shared my DNA. While I moved into a sleek, quiet apartment overlooking the city, a space provided by the foundation that felt more like a sanctuary than a home, my former family was navigating the wreckage of their reputations. The news cycle was relentless. In a world obsessed with authenticity, the story of the parents who abandoned their daughter in a blizzard only to try and monetize her heroism was the ultimate social sin. My father's firm collapsed within the month. Clients didn't want to be associated with a man whose moral compass was so profoundly broken, and Julian was asked to resign from his firm to avoid a public relations nightmare. A few weeks after the new year, I was sitting in my new office at the Sterling Foundation, when my assistant informed me that a man was in the lobby demanding to see me. It was Richard. He didn't look like the polished, intimidating patriarch I had grown up fearing. He looked small, his suit slightly wrinkled, his face etched with the stress of a man who had lost his grip on the world. When he walked into my office, he didn't apologize. He didn't ask how I was. Instead, he started talking about the family legacy and how I had a responsibility to fix the mess I had created. He told me that as the head of a major foundation, I could easily funnel a contract his way to save his business. He spoke as if the night of the gala had been a mere misunderstanding that we could move past for the sake of the family brand. I let him talk until his voice ran dry. I remembered the feeling of the ice hitting my face when he closed the door on Christmas Eve. I remembered the smell of the smoke from the Sterling's car. I looked at him and told him that my responsibility was to the people the foundation served, the vulnerable, the discarded, and the hardworking. I told him that based on his recent performance and the data we had gathered on his business practices, he was a liability. I used his own words against him. I told him he was a dead weight who only brought problems, and that I didn't see any value in a partnership. The look of pure, impotent rage on his face was the final closure I didn't even know I needed. He was escorted out by security, the same way I had been escorted out of my own life just weeks prior. My mother tried a different tactic. She sent letters filled with flowery language about maternal bonds and the sanctity of the holidays. She blamed my father for everything, claiming she was just a passenger in his decisions. But I remembered her eyes that night. I remembered her worrying about her social standing while I stood shivering in the foyer. I didn't reply to the letters. I didn't block them either. I simply let them exist as noise in the background of a life that was now filled with purpose. I spent my days working alongside Arthur and Evelyn, who became the grandparents I never truly had. They mentored me, not just in business, but in how to use power with grace and empathy. The true revenge wasn't in the public shaming or the financial ruin of my family. It was in my complete indifference to them. I had reached a point where their opinions, their anger, and even their desperate pleas for help no longer moved the needle of my emotions. I was no longer defined by their rejection. Every project I launched through the foundation, building shelters, funding community centers, and creating emergency response programs for rural highways, was a brick in a new legacy that had nothing to do with the Vance name. By the following Christmas, I was invited to the Sterling's private estate for a quiet dinner. There were no cameras, no business cards, and no pretension. It was just a group of people who genuinely cared for one another, sitting around a fire while the snow fell softly outside. My phone stayed in my bag, silent and ignored. I didn't need to check if my parents had messaged me. I didn't need to see if Julian had posted another bitter rant on social media. I was exactly where I was meant to be. My life had indeed been turned upside down, but the descent into the ditch that night had been the only way to climb out of the shadows. I had lost a job and a family, but I had found a calling and a soul. As I looked at the glowing embers of the fireplace, I realized that the best way to get even with people who think you are nothing is to become everything they are incapable of being. I was Ainsley. I was 25 now, and for the first time in my life, I was truly home. I hope this story reminded you that your value is never defined by those who fail to see it. If you want to hear more stories of resilience and the ultimate vindication, stay tuned to my calm revenge. Thank you for being part of this journey.